Welcome back. Oshkosh leaders are raising concerns over deteriorating state highways, saying their condition is affecting quality of life in the city. The new state budget includes more money for the state highway rehabilitation program, but Oshkosh officials are calling for a long-term fix. New at 4, Maria Parmigiani tells us what Oshkosh is looking for from state legislators.
Officials telling me this is one of many conversations, as this will be ongoing because road construction is not a one-time thing.
Oshkosh is facing a growing challenge that impacts every resident, every business, and every visitor that travels through our city. And that's the deteriorating condition of state highways.
Oshkosh city leaders say they're hoping that the state legislature doesn't forget highway funding in future budgets.
The biggest thing is trying to make sure that the legislature, as they're working on budget bills, keeps infrastructure a priority.
Right now, the process isn't as simple as pulling from available funds, but rather the budget gets approved and then funding is issued for those 2 years. Officials want to make sure that the state can get ahead in terms of road repair.
The issue is that one-time funding does not sustain beyond, and so we've got to look at how we fund our roads in a proactive way rather than reactive.
Where that funding is going to come from, officials don't have an answer, but they want to make sure that the money continues to come in.
The funding has to be reliable and continuous, right? Because road projects and road repair are not a one and done.
They add having these conversations are an important part of making sure the roads stay safe for you and your family. In Oshkosh, Maria Parmigiani, Action 2 News.